First of all, we have to just introduce you for the video. This is E.J. Dionne from the Washington Post.
Thank you. I was happy to give $5 happy because I'm happy to be here, but I also appreciated the free breakfast. But I know, Dave, it was free but priceless. I will always carry that with me.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful line. And it's really kind of you to have a journalist in here. My wife is a lawyer, and I always tell her that, there are those rankings of most loved professions in America. And, you often have like folks in the military at the top, nurses and doctors at the top, and way down the bottom are lawyers and journalists often. And I tell my wife that we journalists are very grateful to lawyers because they often keep us out of the cellar. But if there are any lawyers in the room, I want to say I literally love lawyers. My wife, my son, my sister. But it is really, really delightful to be here. I'm really happy it's the second Rotary Club I've gotten to speak to recently. And I love the Rotary Club for a bunch of reasons. One is that list back there. And when you look at that list, it really is what you need to preserve a democracy. That is what that list in the end is about. I love Rotary clubs because of that word underneath, international. And Rotarians really show that you can love your own country and still understand that there are people all over the world who share our values, whom we care about, who care about us, and that we have to work together. The third thing I love about you guys is how much money you give to scholarships. I think almost everybody in this room probably knew somebody at some point who got a Rotary scholarship to study somewhere around the world, and it's just great work that you do. And finally, I do always like to underscore how important what we call civil society or intermediate institutions are to a free society. Because we talk a lot about government, we talk a lot about the economic market, but without civil society institutions, there are a lot of problems that go unsolved. And we have a great deal of trouble preserving a free society. One reason dictators try to crack down or take control of all these independent groups. You're not in the market to make money. You're not part of the state, and yet you're vital. And so it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. Democracy is also based on something that's now popular, crowdsourcing. The idea that all of us together, thinking together, can better represent the interests of the whole, and we get to better ideas. But this idea of accountability and holding our leaders responsible for what they do is what allows for innovation and change and improvement. And you're seeing problems in China now. And the fact is, all the people who said these dictatorships were the way of the future in the 1930s proved to be wrong. And democracy triumphed. And I think it's something we should think about at the moment when democracy is under pressure. So my friend Miles and I, in writing this book, really want to go all the way with democracy. And I appreciate Dave mentioning that he was down in Australia, because the idea we put forward in the book is the system Australians use in their elections. People call it compulsory voting. We call it universal voting. It's not just, there's somebody in the room I met who's in marketing. It's not just that in the United States, universal voting plays far better than the word compulsory voting, because we don't like anything compulsory. My friend and I did a lot of arguments for this idea, made the case for this idea over the last year. And a lot of people say people won't get back lives. How in the heck are you going to make them all? Which I'll get to, but we actually call it universal voting because in good American fashion, we have an out here. So what is the idea that we're putting forward? Well, I'll just describe the system as it works in Australia, which we essentially propose for here with a few variations. In Australia, the government makes it very easy to register to vote and helps everybody register to vote, with the result that 96% of Australians are registered to vote. If you don't vote, they also, by the way, make it very easy to vote. And so, for example, in your state, you could vote in any polling place in your state. They hold elections on Saturday. We don't propose Saturday, and it raises, for example, religious issues for Orthodox Jews or more Orthodox Jews. So, but we do think Election Day should be a holiday. But they also make it very easy for people to vote, as we did during the pandemic. But you can go to any polling place in your state. Because everybody votes, Election Day is a kind of holiday in the country. And when you go to the polling places, there are all kinds of people selling fantastic food because they're raising money for school groups, civic groups. Election Day is a civic celebration. And we forget that in a democracy, government should be closely connected to civic life. And Australians are famous for what they call democracy sausages. There is a grill almost everywhere. And I just want you to know, in our book, we endorse democracy sausages, but also propose vegan all.
Uh-oh.
Sorry?
No, there was.
Oh, somebody about
I
vegans?
forgot to mute the folks on the Zoom, but you're good.
Oh, no, I love to hear wisecracks if people want to come in. There are now rating services for the best food at the best polling place. So you can pick your polling place by the food. If you don't vote in Australia, if you're on the list and you don't vote, you get a little notice from the government asking you, why didn't you vote? Why were you unable to vote? You can give an excuse, and they pretty broadly accept excuses. If you have, somebody that's sick in the family or something like that. Only about 13% of non-voters pay a fine. If you do pay the fine, it's $15 American. We propose, it's $20 Australian, $15 American, and it's just normal. So you get turnouts of 90% of that 96% turnout election after election after election. And if you're plugging an idea, you rarely have good proof of concept. Australia has used this system for 100 years. And has kept this system for 100 years. Sometimes people say we should, propose getting rid of it, but it never carries. It's interesting. An idea like this probably needs bipartisan support, which unfortunately in our current climate is unlikely on almost anything except, a phrase like "I love Rotary clubs." But it was originally proposed by the Conservatives in Australia, who were worried about a rising labor movement. The alternative, the Progressive Party, is called the Labor Party. But the Labor Party looked at it and said, no, we think we can do okay under that system too. So it came into effect. It started in states in Australia and then spread to the whole country. That's our hope here. And so our system would work, the system we propose would work pretty much like the Australians, with a few exceptions. In good American fashion, we know that some of the objections to this would be libertarian. The government can't tell me that I have to vote. And so we propose that people could apply, and it would be available freely for conscientious objector status. If you really, 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 really don't want to vote, you could just get conscientious objector status. You'd never have to pay the fine. There are some religious groups in the country that object to participating in elections, but we wouldn't limit it to religious reasons. If you have whatever reason you had, you could get out of this system. The second thing is, we're very careful. We don't want to multiply lots and lots of fines on people. We don't want this, so the fine that if you'd have to pay it, would not be a criminal fine. It could not be increased with penalties or interest. It's a one-time fine. People, I was at a TV studio last year making a case for this, and the person behind the camera said, gee, I got to go pay my fine. I forgot to vote in my country. She was Australian, and she sort of accepted that as part of life. Ralph Nader was in Australia, and he supports this idea, which I'm still mad at Ralph for the 2000 election, but I actually worked for him many, many years ago when I was a student. But Ralph was talking to a cab driver, and he was trying to bait him, and he said, you know, it must be horrible that your country makes you vote. And the cab driver got very, very proud and said, it's my civic duty, sir. And that is the culture that everybody voting creates. One of my favorite pictures of elections in Australia is of 4 people in wetsuits near Bondi Beach with their surfboards leaning against the voting booth as they cast their ballots. They came out of the surf, did their civic duty, went back into the surf. That's a nice idea. That's a nice idea all by itself. What difference would this make? It would bring into the electorate groups that are underrepresented. Younger people are underrepresented in our electorate. Older, lower income people are underrepresented. We older people are actually, well, I won't implicate any of you in being older. I'm older. Older people are overrepresented. Racial minorities, Black Americans are not all that underrepresented, but they are, and they face particular burdens in certain states now. Latinos are underrepresented. Working class people in general are underrepresented. If you look at the kinds of groups that are underrepresented, we think they would balance off in partisan terms, because as people know, blue-collar whites right now tend to be in a lot of places more Republican. They would go up in the electorate. Minorities and young people are more Democratic. They would go up in the electorate. And we have some evidence in the book for how the impact of this in partisan terms would be very mild. And you can see cases where higher turnout work either way in an election. Secondly, elections would become less like fancy dinner parties. Think about the fancy dinner party. There is an A list, you know, the people you really want to come. And then if some of them don't come, you got the B list, and then maybe you got a C list. That's what our electoral process is like. We've got an A list of likely voters, and Rotarians are probably likely voters. So I'm amazed that we are already getting mail at our house for the next election because we are inveterate voters, my wife and I, in primaries at elections. So the A-listers get invited all the time to vote, because you may not like getting all that political propaganda, or maybe you do. I enjoy it. But it's actually people saying, we care about what you think because you are going to vote. The B-listers tend to be people who might be registered but don't vote very much. They don't get much attention at all. And the C-listers may not be registered. And so they get no attention. And so we got a kind of vicious cycle here, because the system itself always invites the same people back in to the process over and over again. And the whole swaths of people do not get any attention at all. The other thing this would do is it would reverse the incentives. We should be very proud as a country of what we did in the pandemic election in 2000. We were looking in April of 2000 at an election where, if we didn't change our system, people were going to have to risk their lives in order to cast a ballot, to exercise their democratic rights. And all over the country, in Republican states and Democratic states and Republican and Democratic localities, election officials, sometimes by changing the law, sometimes just by changing practices, made it very, very easy for people to vote. And guess what? Turnout soared in the 2000 election. Now, yeah, the turnout soared because the stakes were seen as very high on both sides, but it also soared because we made it very easy to vote. I was very proud to cast my ballot in a drop box in front of Walt Whitman High School for 2 reasons. One is all 3 of our kids went to Walt Whitman High School, so I thought that's a great place to vote. But Walt Whitman was the poet of American democracy. So when I dropped my ballot, and I thought, this is a poetic act. But we did make it easier to vote, and people responded. And we have a whole series of reforms that we propose that are kind of preliminary to this, because we did some polling on this. And I joke that Miles and I are either the dumbest or most honest book writers you'll ever think, because we have polling in the book that shows right now only about a quarter of Americans support this idea. Now, we thought a quarter is pretty good for an idea that no one has ever advanced systematically. And the polling also shows that about another 25% of us is open to the idea and is persuadable. One of the objections is, how can you penalize somebody for not voting if we have laws that make it harder for people to vote? If you have really hard to meet or complicated to meet voter ID laws, if you're restricting the times that people can vote, you're cutting back on drop boxes and all of that. So we want to make it, as Australia does, as easy as possible for everyone to cast a ballot. We noted libertarian objections to this, which is one reason why we thought the conscientious objector status would sort of take care for people who really do not want this to happen. What was interesting about our polling is that the underlying idea that we're advancing is that voting is both a right and a duty. And 61% of Americans, equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, by the way, think of voting as both a right and a duty. And that's what we are talking about here. Since the pandemic election, our country is really becoming two countries on voting. Before the election, almost all states were trying to make it easier to vote. Since the election, about half the states have made it harder again, and half the states have moved forward from where we were. We think that we should make it as easy as possible for people to vote, and that everyone has an obligation to democracy to vote. And we think this system will, this won't solve all our problems. And we are very clear here. We're not, Miles and I are not like magic elixir salesmen. Take this and all our problems will disappear. Now, we have a lot of other problems that we talk about at the end of the book. But we do think that a more inclusive democracy where everybody knows that everybody is going to vote would actually get rid of some of the problems we have about legitimacy and concern about whether government is represented, concern that, well, maybe somebody's rigging this to include one group and exclude the other. And you've got those fears on both sides of the electorate. We think that we could make democracy better. My favorite line on democracy, and I'll close with this, is from Reinhold Niebuhr. Some of you may know Niebuhr, the great theologian. And Niebuhr once said, and forgive the gendered language, he said it a long time ago, he said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. And I've always loved that idea that our desire to include everybody, to hear all voices, to have a society that's fair and committed to truth and goodwill and better relationships and universally beneficial government, those good moral commitments are what make democracy possible. But we also know that human beings are flawed, that people grasp for power, that people abuse power, and democracy is a check on them. It's our way of, as I started, making government accountable. So man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. We think democracy is necessary. We think we can make democracy better and more inclusive. And that's why we hope over time, when people look to Australia, everybody should indeed go to Australia and take a look at how this system works. And there are about 24 countries that use this system. Chile had it, got rid of it, put it back in again recently. 24 democracies use it. We think we can make our democracy better and more representative. And so I hope you'll join my friend and me in trying to make our democracy, we talk about a more perfect union. I'll close on this. I love the phrase more perfect. In this world, there's very little perfect other than a perfect Rotary Club meeting. And I think we can improve ourselves because the US is really a story of ongoing self-correction. And that's one of the things I love about the place. Thank you all very much. And please. By the way, one of the fun things about talking about this is it's not an idea many people think about, and it doesn't quite fit into the usual political divide. So it's actually fun to argue about something that has not been advanced, and therefore we don't immediately know what we think of it, except for those who just can't stand anything compulsory. But go ahead.
So my concern and worry is that an informed electorate is critical. And so my question to you, as our country has become so polarized, is I'm not so sure that everybody voting necessarily is going to be the best, because if people aren't informed and they're swayed by their tribe or whatever, then possibly we won't necessarily progress with a democracy of the values that are best for the country. I wondered if you could just talk about that.
You know, it's very interesting you asked that. We have a series of objections people raise. We actually polled on the informed electorate part. It turns out only a minority of us talk about that. Somebody asked this question once, and somebody in the audience yelled out, "You think our current electorate is informed?" And that's not my position, but that was what somebody yelled in the audience. Two things. I think that who is to make the choice that somebody is informed, and what kind of information do you think someone should have? And once you get to, we have rejected the idea in the past that the electorate should be confined to some group of people. When our country started, the only people who were thought to be informed were white men of property. And so we confine the franchise to them because, well, they're the people who are responsible and know things. And over time, the great American story is we've enfranchised more and more people because we understand that democracy means democracy. A democratic republic needs to be democratic, so that first we enfranchised all men with or without property. After the Civil War, we enfranchised Black Americans, and then the South, the franchise got taken away when Reconstruction fell, and it took 100 years to get back to that. We enfranchised women with the 19th Amendment. So we have been steadily saying democracy is democracy. The other thing is, how do people get informed? They get informed if they're engaged. I have an interview in the book. I talked to an old friend of mine who was the leader of the Labor Party down there. He had been standing outside the polls all his life because his dad was in politics. And he said, when you go in, you can tell the people who are real political junkies and the ones who may be brought into the system by this. But he said, what struck me is they were not obsessed with politics. He said there are no QAnon nuts among those, the folks you're bringing into the system, but they cared enough because they were enfranchised, because the parties reached out to them. They knew it was an obligation. And so when we know we have an obligation, we tend to inform ourselves. And so, as I say, I reject on principle the idea that we should judge who is informed. We had those fake literacy tests in the South that were designed to exclude African Americans. But the process of pulling people in, I think, has the effect of increasing information. And by the way, we spend a lot of money. Political parties spend a fortune just to get their voters to the polls. If you know everybody's going to vote, you don't have to waste that money. And a lot more of it goes into persuasion rather than dragging people to the polling place. So I think that, number one, I think that a universal electorate would be at least equally informed to this one. And I think if you pull everybody in, everybody will have more of an incentive to be informed, and they'll all get that mail and propaganda. And there's evidence that even though a lot of that stuff is propaganda, it actually gives voters useful signals about what's going on. So that's my gut.
Hi, I'm Ayşe. And I'm originally from Turkey. Turkey is not necessarily a model of democracy, but it's the outcome.
But it has been at times.
But I would say that, I studied political science. My husband teaches American political systems at Georgetown, and he tried to explain to me all the time the systems. And to this day, I find it so confusing why American population overall is so against this idea, because in Turkey, our elections are also a duty, and that everybody votes, and we have 88% turnout. We think that's apathy, very low for us. And and it's on a Sunday. And theoretically, there is like a fine if you don't vote in Turkey, but nobody really presses it.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's so much easier. So I've always wondered, which was one of your questions was like one answer, like, why is there such resistance? And it's also, we also have a social security card with our pictures since we were born. And then we just show that. So you can show your passport. I voted last election at the airport because I was traveling. We could vote it at the embassy. It's counted so much faster. I don't know why is it so hard in the United States to get this idea. So I'd love to hear what other reasons people find it so difficult.
Well, partly, first of all, thank you for that. And the turnout in the last presidential election was enormous. Turkey's a good case, by the way, just for an aside. To have a genuinely free and liberal democracy, you also need a free press, which Erdogan has gotten in the way of. Free association, and Erdogan jailed some of his opponents. So, voting is essential, but you need other things. So but the system itself encouraged in the first round, the turnout really was quite extraordinary. And you see that, but again, only 25 countries have adopted this. So we're not unique in resisting universal voting. We found that the major, I'm just going to try to find the page with our polling numbers in it. We found that the major resistance was simply the idea of compulsion. And that is a very American kind of thing, that we just don't like people to be compelled. Let me just, aren't you nice? What a good man. Where is, we gave people a bunch of reasons, and as people most strongly opposed to it, the first reason by far was people have a right not to participate in elections. That's what people think. Second big reason, there were already too many government fines and taxes. That was, people don't like that. It would disproportionately punish those who already have the hardest time voting. That wasn't as high as the first two, but we think that's a legitimate objection, which is why we want to make it as easy as possible. And to your reason, sir, what really struck us is only about a quarter gave it would cause too many uneducated people to vote. That was a low percentage. So I think partly it's our tradition, partly groups have had to fight for the right to vote. I think racism also plays a role in opposition to this. But we are trying, my friend has set up an organization called 100% Democracy, and we're trying to see if we can get this adopted in either states or cities. They're in 13 states, their state constitutions would allow, we think, cities to adopt this on their own. So we'd like to see experiments around the country. I have a dream of Utah, Vermont, and DC trying it. And the reason I picked that group is Vermont and Utah are actually pretty reform-minded states. One is quite Democratic, although they have a Republican governor right now. Utah is very Republican, and DC, but both are very white. So we also want a diverse place. DC could adopt it. Well, we want to see how this could work in parts of our country. And when our federal system works, it's good for experiments like that. But thank you for your experience, sir.
I don't think you answered her question, and I think it's a very important question.
See, I've been in Washington a long time. I don't have vague questions.
Aisha asked, and it's a very valid question. Why in America don't people feel incentivized and motivated to go to the polls? That's what you can't understand, and it's a very good question.
No, but
just a moment, sir. Thank you. Okay. So what she said, what you said is that your number one reason is that people didn't want to be, they weren't compelled, they didn't want the government to compel them to vote. But I don't think it's that. I honestly don't. I think that behind this is is it skepticism? Is it not belief in that my vote counts? What's really behind that? I'd appreciate if you go a little deeper.
One of the reasons we advance this idea is precisely because of the skepticism that you are, you're rightly saying exists in some of the electorate. And we think, And, you know, we could sort of take a look at surveys over the last 20 years and sort of parse them and see how close this is, whether we come to agree on this. But I think that one of the reasons is people are skeptical that their political leaders represent them or represent all of us, or they think they're partial to particular groups. And again, in the end of the book, we think there are a lot of other problems in our system. People mistrust the role of money in politics. They worry that moneyed interests have too much impact on the outcome. Other people worry about whether politicians even listen to them. And what we're arguing, and we can, the proof will be in the pudding, but it works in Australia, that people, when they know that everybody participates, will have the sense that this is a broadly representative democratic system. By the way, the other effect this would likely have is that it would bring in a lot of non-ideological voters. Because if you know that everybody's going to vote, you can't spend all your time appealing to your political base. What happens when a system incentivizing appealing to your political base? You spend a lot of your time saying how wretched, awful, terrible the other side is, which itself is demobilizing. Imagine an airline that said, don't fly that airline, they crash. Or a financial firm says, don't invest in that other financial firm, too much embezzlement for too long. That's what our campaigns are like. This system, we think, would, when you know that you're not just trying to mobilize your base, but you're trying to get in all kinds of people who may not be ideologues, has, I think, creates incentives, and it does this in Australia, and they have tough politics. I'm not romanticizing Australia, but parties there tend to appeal fairly broadly across across the political spectrum. What they also have in Australia, which I support, which is not what I'm arguing for today, but I am for it, is preference voting or single transferable vote. So let's say you're a libertarian, but all things being equal, you're probably more Republican than Democratic. You can put a 1 next to libertarian and 2 next to the Republicans. If you're a Green, you can put 1 next to the Green, 2 next to the Democrat. But you don't have to worry your vote will be wasted, because if you really prefer the Democrat over the Republican or the Republican over the Democrat, you don't use that other option. In Australia, you can do that. And so this allows third party voices in, but in the context of a fairly strong 2-party system, it gives you, I think, the best of both worlds. And I think that too reduces alienation, because as my co-author said, this system not only tells everybody that they count, but it will count their votes exactly as they intended to be. It will read their votes exactly as they intended them to be read. So that's at least a partial answer to your good question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What an excellent, one of the things that I love about Rotary is our opportunity to hear a lot of diverse ideas. This was particularly interesting. And I'm really, really glad to hear that you liked, that you think that you're impressed by the 4-way test, because sharing with you a point. And it has on it, if you have your reading glasses, the 4-way test on it.
Oh, I should have brought some. I'm sorry. It is available. I'll sound like I'm plugging the owner of my newspaper, but so it is available online at various websites that sell books. I'm sorry.
Republican businessman.
Yeah, I should have bought the books. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.